When you think about India's fight for independence, your mind probably jumps to Gandhi, to huge mass protests. But the story really starts way earlier, with a group that's often dismissed as, well, a polite and kinda ineffective debating club. But what if I told you that wasn't weakness at all? What if it was actually cover for one of the most brilliant, long-term strategies in modern history? Let's dig in.
For decades, the standard take on the early leaders of the Indian National Congress wasn't exactly flattering. They were seen as pretty timid, mostly just relying on what their critics called political begging. Endless petitions, polite prayers, and super formal memorials sent to the British government. It sounds completely ineffective, doesn't it? But this is where the whole story flips. What if that apparent weakness was just a mask? What if, hiding behind all those humble petitions, there was a master plan slowly clicking into place?
Okay, so the first clue to cracking the strategy is figuring out who these petitions were really for. And here's a hint. It wasn't the British. They had a secret audience in mind the whole time. So let's picture this. It's 1891, and you've got a young, passionate Gopal Krishna Gokhale. Imagine him pouring weeks of his life, all his energy, into crafting this perfect, detailed memorial for the government. And the response he gets? A blunt, two-line dismissal. He was just crushed. He felt like it was all a complete waste of time. But his mentor, the brilliant Justice Ranade, he saw the bigger picture. He pulled Gokhale aside and explained that, look, the memorials were never really for the British. As Ranade said, they are nominally addressed to government. In reality, they are addressed to the people. They were a textbook. They were a tool for mass political education, teaching everyday Indians to think about their rights and their nation in a totally new way. And that was the real mission here, politicization. You see, you can't just launch a struggle against a global empire without a nation that is politically awake and aware. The petitions weren't meant to persuade the rulers, they were meant to awaken the people.
But waking up a population is really just step one. An awakened people needs direction. They need a unified leadership. They needed, for lack of a better term, a headquarters.
The founders of the Congress, they knew a fundamental truth about any large-scale movement. An army without generals is just a mob. So before they could ever launch a real movement, their second strategic goal was to build that headquarters, to find the key leaders from all across India and forge them into one single, cohesive command structure. And this wasn't an accident, it was completely by design. I mean, look at the stated goals of the very first Congress session. It's not about petitions or demands, it's all about connection. It's about getting these earnest workers, as they called them, to become personally known to each other. It was about breaking down all those provincial prejudices and actually building friendships. So now they had an awakening public and a unified leadership. The third crucial piece of the strategy was to give them a brand new political language, a completely new way to even imagine what their future could be. This idea from Dadabhai Naoroji, I know, it might seem obvious to us now, but you have to understand at the time, this was absolutely revolutionary. For centuries, the unquestioned truth was that people exist to serve the king. The Congress came in and turned that entire idea on its head, introducing this modern democratic idea that, no, governments exist to serve the people. And this ideological battle was just central to everything they did. You had the British colonial state, which was authoritarian and bureaucratic. There was no public voice. But in stark contrast, the Congress organized itself like a parliament from its very first day. They used democratic debate, open discussion, and voting to make their decisions. They weren't just asking for democracy, they were living it, planting its roots deep in Indian soil. And this, right here, this gets to the absolute heart of their whole strategy. A real nationalist struggle doesn't just start with protests in the street. It starts as a battle of ideas. First, you have to define the enemy, colonialism itself. And then you have to forge a common identity, a sense of we that's strong enough to actually fight back. But waging this ideological war right under the noses of the British, well, that required some seriously clever political maneuvering. And that brings us to the very controversial role of the Congress's British co-founder, A.O. Hume. So the conventional theory, the one that was taught for years, was that the British cleverly used Hume to create the Congress as a safety valve. The idea was, hey, let's give these educated Indians a harmless little club to vent their frustrations, and that'll stop them from starting another violent uprising like the one in 1857.
But the Indian founders were playing a much, much smarter game. They were using Hume as a lightning conductor. You have to remember, this was only a few decades after the 1857 rebellion. The British were incredibly paranoid. Any all-India political organization would have been seen as a massive threat and probably crushed before it even got started.
And Gokhale himself confirmed this years later. He basically said that having a retired British official as the public face gave them the perfect cover. It was a shield that the young Congress desperately needed to survive and grow. The British thought they were installing a safety valve, but in reality, the Indian leaders were building a lightning rod. And this brings us to what might be the most profound, the most amazing part of their entire strategy. It's this truly remarkable understanding of their own place in history. By the early 1900s, a new, more radical generation was getting impatient. They were criticizing the old guard in the Congress for being too slow, too moderate. But for leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji, this wasn't failure. This was their greatest success. The very impatience they had created was proof that their job was done. They had successfully manufactured the demand for freedom that would fuel the next stage of the struggle.
And this quote from Gokhale, it's just breathtaking. It shows a complete lack of ego and this incredibly deep understanding of what it takes to build a nation. They knew their job wasn't to win the final victory. Their job was to do the hard, thankless, foundational work. They would serve India by failing, knowing that out of their failures, the next generation would finally build the strength to succeed.
So when we look back and judge the early Congress, we shouldn't measure them by petitions won or lost. That's missing the entire point. Their real success was so much bigger. They succeeded in their real objectives, to politicize an entire people, to build a national leadership from scratch, and to forge a new political ideology. They laid the entire foundation upon which these spectacular mass movements of the 20th century were built. And that really leaves us with a provocative thought, doesn't it? In any great endeavor, we're all obsessed with getting those quick, visible wins. But the story of the early Congress suggests that maybe the real victory is in the slow, patient, unseen work of building a foundation so strong that future success becomes almost inevitable. So is it possible that laying the foundation is more important than winning the first battle?